Good afternoon to you. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to our tropical weather outlook for today, Wednesday, July 31st, 2024. We're watching an area in the Atlantic that could potentially develop over the next several days, and things are starting to get interesting, especially for those across the Southeast and Florida as we head into early next week, at least with this latest batch of model guidance that came out between yesterday and today. Also, the Eastern Pacific is starting to get more active, and they'll probably dominate at least over the next week or so. They already saw a formation of a tropical depression today, and we're probably going to see more of those once again within the next week. So we have a lot to go over today. Let's start off, though, with the Atlantic by the National Hurricane Center. As of 2 p.m., we have a 60% chance of our area, which is now near the islands. Not yet an invest area, but I'm pretty sure over the next several days, we'll probably see that happen. But once again, we're really looking for development, especially as this gets towards the Bahamas and potentially right near by the time this reaches the southeast United States. When that happens, though, it is still going to be within the 5 to 10 day time frame, so there's still lots of uncertainty in terms of what impacts will be. But I can tell you for sure the islands will definitely get quite a bit of impacts when it comes to thunderstorms and heavy rain and gusty winds. Obviously, will not be from a tropical system, whereas a fully developed tropical cyclone, but at least over the next several days, as this area of interest traverses westward, there will be impacts brought to the Northern Islands and then into the Bahamas, and then whatever ends up from that will be of interest once again for the Southeast. And we'll go over all the model guidance, talking about what could potentially be on the cards as once again as we head towards the end of the week into early next week. On the other hand, in the Eastern Pacific, again, things are getting more active. We now have Tropical Depression 3E. Maximum sustained winds 35 miles an hour, a minimum central pressure of 1,007 millibars. And this is going to move to the west-northwest away from Mexico. None of this looks like it'll be very threatening at all to land. But nonetheless, it'll still be development that we'll see in the Eastern Pacific. We have another area out here. This is Invest 95E. Looks like this won't develop as much as we thought before, but we have another area to the southeast of Tropical Depression 3 in the Pacific, and this has an 80% chance over the next 7 days that we could potentially see another tropical system form out of this. So once again, Eastern Pacific getting more active. They'll probably be dominating over the next several days to the next several weeks, before the Atlantic will probably get more active as we head towards the end of the month in August. But we're still watching an area in the Atlantic, obviously. But really quickly, though, with Tropical Depression 3, once again, as I mentioned, going to move out to the west-northwest away from Mexico. Probably could become a hurricane. This will probably be the first Pacific hurricane of the season there. Some of the model guidance somewhat aggressive on the system. Regardless, this will be staying away from Mexico. We'll still see impacts, though, from swells. Especially if this becomes potent enough of a storm, this will probably send swells to the coast, and that'll probably mean a more heightened rip current risk, which can be fatal, by the way. And in many cases, people that have not been, that careful along the coast with heightened rip current risks, we have seen instances where people have lost their lives. So that'll definitely be an impact, even though it will not be a direct impact. But regardless, this will once again move away from the coast, and it could potentially become a hurricane. And just to kind of back that up, the National Hurricane Center track, here's all the latest model guidance as of the 12Z issue, and you can see all of them once again take it away from the coast. So Tropical Depression 3 not looking like much of any concern for land. In terms of what's happening, though, generally in terms of our area of the Western Hemisphere, you can see quite a bit of activity occurring now, especially with our wave in the islands. It's become a lot more convectively active today. Once again, that's producing lots of showers and thunderstorms for the islands, and it'll probably continue to do so over the next several days, and then it'll really become of interest in what it does by the time it gets near the Bahamas and near the southeast, especially Florida. And then the Eastern Pacific, you could see we still have a lot of convective activity going on. Tropical Depression 3 over here. And that'll obviously be something that once again we'll be watching in the Eastern Pacific over the next several days. But in terms of Atlantic interest, it's really going to be this wave that'll be the biggest area of concern. Although it is not much right now, you can see on the 850 millibar vorticity. Definitely, though, there is some reflection of energy associated with this. But once again, we're looking at much more of a consolidation over by the time we get to probably the Bahamas area, and looks like even more that we could see more of this being in play for the Gulf, although probably more the Eastern Gulf than anywhere else. But regardless, this is a tropical wave. It does have energy associated with it, and you can see it pretty clearly once again showing up on the 850 millibar vorticity. And you can see, by the way, 3E. And obviously, we do not look like what the signature of the vorticity for 3E is, so we definitely have a lot more work to go in terms of development of this wave. And even Tropical Depression 3 has more development that the work it has to do, which will probably do so over the next several days, as it'll probably become a hurricane as once again it moves off to the west northwest. But as I was mentioning with this wave, it is still a tropical wave. It still has energy, obviously, and that'll definitely be of impacts regardless of this being a tropical storm or not for the islands. And that means heavy rain, gusty winds, all that kind of stuff. That is all still going to be there, and those are all impacts that we still see in tropical systems either way, and it's still enough of an inconvenience, even though this will not be a fully tropical system. So if you're in the islands over the next several days, definitely keep that in mind, and of course, plan accordingly. So we have that out of the way. Let's actually take a look at the modeling now. Let's start off, though, just to get it out of the way. Let's start off in the Eastern Pacific, just to drive the point home that over the next several days, let's just run the GFS. You can see Tropical Depression 3 becomes a lot more bona fide. GFS seems to make it into a pretty decent hurricane as it moves out to sea to the west, and then obviously right behind that, you can see our next system follows suit as well. This seems to become an even more potent system, and then that takes us out to the next week. So obviously the Pacific will definitely be dominating in terms of activity. Once again, things are more favorable there right now, and wouldn't shock me, as I said yesterday and the day before, wouldn't shock me, one, if we get probably at least 2 or 3 more named storms in the Pacific over the next several days. And looking at the GFS, maybe even 1 or 2 extra hurricanes in the Pacific as well. About time, though, since they've really been not so active so far this season. In the Atlantic, on the other hand, you could actually see on the 12Z run, this is indeed the wave that we're watching that is near the islands right now. You can see the GFS solution still going towards a lot more of a slower development, and obviously that means because of that, we'll see a lot of the wave energy move directly over the Greater Antilles and will probably ride all of the northern islands. So anywhere that's in the northern Caribbean should definitely be on the lookout for gusty winds and heavy rains till the end of the week associated with this tropical wave. And then the GFS kind of emerges this into the Gulf as we head into early next week. But what they do is kind of interesting, and it's also interesting that the GFS has been very consistent on the solution, despite the fact when we saw the Euro, especially yesterday and the days before, showing this as a potent system off the Carolinas coast. Now we're starting to see all of that begin to shift a little more towards the GFS solution, and I'll show you with the European ensembles as well in just a moment. But the GFS does something very interesting. They have this storm kind of go into Florida at 5 days, and this is 5 days out, and this would obviously change, but I'm going to bring up the other models here to kind of show why it's a little interesting why we have this scenario, because after that, moves into Florida, but then it seems to stall out and then kind of does this dance around. And then as we extend that out into 10 days, they kind of just have this storm move into Florida and just stall it out. And that is especially of particular concern because how many times in the past have we seen instances where storms, they develop maybe, and obviously this storm on the GFS does look like a pretty decent storm actually. Obviously not going to be a, full-on hurricane. I think the GFS does actually make this 984 or 983 millibars. So maybe this might actually be a hurricane. But obviously it's not going to be a terribly strong storm, but this stalls out over one area. You can see 5 days, 6 days, 7 days, even 8 and 9 days over the same area of the northeastern Gulf over and over. And that just means not only the winds will be a concern, but heavy rain being poured on the same area over several days. And we've seen this scenario happen with tropical systems one too many times, especially within the last several years. And that is especially going to be, or it screams to me, a especially big concern for flooding. And that alone is a sole top threat when it comes to tropical systems. So this will definitely be something that we need to watch over the next several days. And I say that because it seems like the other models too are starting to become more on board with the GFS. We look at the Canadian model, we'll look at the European in just a little bit. But the Canadian model now, I think yesterday they had this kind of completely remaining off the eastern coast of the United States. Now the CMC today kind of shows this once again into the Gulf. Does a little bit different than the GFS, where the GFS keeps us entirely in the northeastern Gulf, while the CMC stalls this kind of in between. It crosses the state of Florida, but same general idea, same general region of the United States, which is generally the southeast and Florida. We kind of see this piece of energy get into this area and then get trapped for several days on end. And then we take this right out to 10 days, which not really a wise thing to do, especially given the amount of uncertainty we have here. But the idea remains the same as the GFS. This kind of stalls out, and I can only imagine what kind of threat for rainfall that'll be. And that'll be something that we need to, that if this does actually look like it'll be the case scenario, that'll definitely be something that we're going to have to unpack a lot, especially over the next several days. But this really all pans out as we get towards the end of this week into early next week. So I'd say for right now, anywhere in the southeast really should be very much on top of the tropics, at least as we close out the week and head into the first few days of next week. Generally, the first few days of August now looks like we won't have much besides this. At least if we look at the GFS. Let's actually really quickly take a look at the GFS beyond this, taking it out to 10 days. We have this area that kind of looks interesting. But then obviously besides that, not much else. And let's really quickly just take a look at the end of the GFS run. Not really something we should be doing, and obviously things can also pop up as well. But I think the only biggest area of concern right now will be this wave that we watch in the Atlantic. But it does look like it could potentially be a pretty big area of concern, at least for right now. So we looked at the GFS and the CMC. Just to end it off and kind of go over the rest, let's take a look at the European. The 12's a European right now. If we remember, the European was actually, and we affectionately call it King Euro because the European really seems to be the most accurate when it comes to track forecasts in tropical cyclone tracking, and sometimes genesis as well with these systems. The European has really been most solid over the last several days of showing something very potent off the East Coast. You've seen all the model runs where the European kind of takes this wave energy and then it kind of curves it off Florida and then off the East Coast, and it becomes a hurricane riding the Gulf Stream. Well, on the 12's a European, not anymore. They also are now showing a lot more of the GFS solution, where they take this into the Gulf right into 5 days, and then we see 5 to 6 to even 7 days. This is generally over Florida and the eastern Gulf, far eastern Gulf, for at least 2 or 3 days. Then after that, the European does take this off and try to move it along the East Coast, or at least off the East Coast after that. But the biggest difference is, and I'm actually going to show you this run, the European model run from the 12Z yesterday. The 12Z yesterday clearly did not go into the Gulf, and they just had the storm moving right up and out off the East Coast, away from the Southeast, and no landfall whatsoever, which is obviously different from the 12Z model run today, on the European, which is much more like the GFS. And I think the more important thing is that not only is it King Euro, as we like to say it, the European model that is showing now Gulf, or including the Gulf in its forecasts, instead of completely off the East Coast. But the most important thing is that we're seeing all of the major global models now beginning to kind of agree, on a certain area, which is obviously what we didn't have yesterday, because we had the European off the East Coast and we had the GFS in the Gulf. And I think that is really important, especially given that when we're looking at all of this, we are still 5 to 6 to 7 days out, especially when this remains around Florida. So I think the most important thing we should be looking at right now is, given the time frame, is that we're all starting to see the models converge on one idea. And I think that's the most important thing that we're seeing right now, more than the fact that we're seeing the European show the Gulf, instead of the East Coast now, which would obviously mean a lot more of a threat to the United States in direct impacts than before, and especially with this signature too that the European does, where it kind of just keeps it near Florida in the southeast for several days on end, which will probably mean lots of heavy rain, and potential flooding concerns, which that in itself is a threat that we're going to need to watch very closely as well over the next several days. And I want to show you with the ensembles too, because this is and I think this is especially important to look at, once again, given the time frame we're watching right now. This is the ensembles from the 0Z European. You can see that they're all clearly very much converging off the East Coast, typical of what we've been seeing with the European so far. But compare that to just the 6Z European. I don't have the 12Z ensembles yet, because that loads, I think, in a little bit. But I obviously have to be places in a little bit, so I'm kind of just trying to work with what we have right now. But you can see, even from the 0Z to the 6Z European ensembles, look at the big shift that we have from all of the ensembles in the European converging, off the East Coast to the 6Z, now beginning to show, more members in the Gulf. Majority of them are still off the East Coast, but we're starting to see more ensembles in the Gulf, and that shows not only on the operational side that we're seeing the European kind of cave to what all the other models are showing, and we're starting to see them, agree potentially this being much closer to the United States than we thought before. It's not only important that we see the operational doing that, but it also seems like the ensembles are starting to catch on too. So it really, really is an interesting picture that we're seeing, unfolding right now. And I think this kind of just goes to show just how much can change within the tropics, from day to day. And that's also especially why, you really can't obviously hang your hat on whatever the models show 4 to 5 days out, because even within the 2 to 3 day time frame, things could definitely significantly change. And we're certainly seeing some sort of change ongoing right now with all the models. And we'll have to monitor how this progresses over the next day or so. But it's definitely starting to look more interesting, beyond the Caribbean. We're definitely looking more interesting in the Southeast. And I'd say anybody in the Southeast, even if you're in the Gulf too, the Gulf Coast as well, except probably from the Central Gulf, even up until the Carolinas, I should say. I think I should say everybody in the Southeast. Not going to single anybody out. Given the setup we're looking at, everybody in the Southeast should be watching very closely to see what exactly happens with this. And even in the Bahamas too, keep your tabs on the system as well, because either way, I think you could probably still see, especially those in the southern Bahamas, we'll still probably see gusty winds and heavy rains, from whatever this tropical wave becomes, no matter what, even if this is not a fully tropical system by the time it is in the southern Bahamas. There'll be impacts no matter what. And then finally, though, before I kind of end this all off, especially, if this takes the Eastern Gulf part. And I think this is really going to be something we need to watch in terms of intensity as well, but especially the heavy rains. Look at how warm the Eastern Gulf is. It is very much concerning. And this will obviously be something that will be a concerning thing for the rest of the season ahead of us, especially as we head towards the peak. But look at this widespread 30s, especially near the Florida Gulf Coast, 31 degrees Celsius readings consistently. And that just means so much energy to work with. This is mid to upper 80s, even low 90s in terms of sea surface temperatures. And that really works in favor of producing thunderstorms and adding extra moisture to work with. And that'll probably not only could this affect intensity, especially if this storm stays offshore enough and obviously upper level conditions are favorable enough. Maybe we could even see a stronger storm out of this if this ends up in the Gulf. But in terms of especially heavy rain, just how warm these Gulf waters are, in terms of what that'll do in terms of adding extra moisture to the atmosphere, it's all really a very complex setup, but a very interesting one. And it'll definitely be a setup that we need to watch for the Southeast over the next several days, which is why, as it said in the thumbnail, we will be continuing to watch the Atlantic very closely once again as we head towards the end of this month, as we close the month out today, and as we head towards the beginning of August. And probably beyond that, it'll be only an uphill battle as we get towards the peak of the hurricane season. With that being said, though, not much else to talk about for the rest of today. Obviously, this is still up in the future of the next 4 or 5 days, so definitely there will be a lot of more changes to come over the next several days, and we'll definitely be monitoring those changes as they happen. With that being said, really hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Have a blessed day, a safe one as well. Peace, love, and kindness to you all, and we will talk again tomorrow.